Little boy waves to passing bus every day. 4 years later, driver did something shocking. The ancient maple tree at the corner of Cedar Street cast long shadows in the early morning light, its leaves dancing in the autumn breeze. This was Ethan's favorite spot, not because of the tree's majestic presence, or the way its branches created the perfect hideout, but because at exactly 7:15 a.m., bus Route 42 would rumble past, carrying its passengers toward downtown. Most children his age dreaded early mornings, but 8-year-old Ethan Matthews lived for them. Every day, rain or shine, he would sprint down the cracked sidewalk leading to his spot, his worn-out sneakers slapping against the concrete, his backpack bouncing rhythmically against his small frame. His mother, Sarah, often watched from their modest rental home's window, a mix of pride and worry etched on her tired face. This morning was different, though. Ethan had woken up even earlier than usual, his excitement palpable as he pulled on his favorite red sweater, the one with a small hole in the left sleeve that his mother had carefully mended 3 times already. He had a special surprise planned for today. "Mom!" he called out, rushing into the kitchen where Sarah was preparing his lunch, a simple peanut butter sandwich and an apple she'd saved from her workplace cafeteria. "Do you think Mr. Joe will like my drawing?" Sarah paused, looking at the slightly crumpled paper in her son's hands. On it, drawn with whatever crayons they had left, was a big yellow bus with 2 stick figures, one small and one large, both with enormous smiles. Above them, written in wobbly letters, "Thank you for always waving back." "Oh, honey," she said softly, her heart clenching. They had never met the bus driver, Joe, in person. He was just the kind-faced man who had started waving back at her son 4 years ago, when Ethan was barely 4 and had developed his fascination with the big city bus. "I'm sure he'll love it, but remember, we can't actually give it to him. The bus can't stop here. It's not a designated stop." Ethan's face fell for a moment, but his natural optimism quickly returned. "That's okay. I'll just wave extra big today so he knows I'm happy." Sarah watched as her son carefully tucked the drawing into his backpack anyway, just in case. She wished, not for the first time, that she could afford the bus fare for Ethan to actually ride the bus to school. But their home, though small and in need of repair, was within walking distance of Riverside Elementary, and every dollar she earned at the diner had to be carefully budgeted. At precisely 7:10 a.m., Ethan took his position under the maple tree. His small fingers nervously played with the zipper of his backpack as he waited, eyes fixed on the corner where Route 42 would appear. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and possibility. Inside the approaching bus, Joe Martinez adjusted his mirror, his weathered hands steady on the wheel. 43 years of driving city buses had taught him to notice the small things, the regular passengers' routines, the changing seasons reflected in his route, and especially the little boy who had become as much a part of his morning as his first cup of coffee. The boy had started as a toddler, barely tall enough to see over his mother's garden fence, waving with the unrestrained enthusiasm only a child could muster. Now, 4 years later, he was a fixture of Route 42, as reliable as the sunrise. Joe had watched him grow taller, had noticed when he started wearing a school backpack, had seen him standing strong even on days when the rain poured or snow filled the air. As the bus rounded the corner, Joe felt the familiar warmth spread through his chest at the sight of Ethan's small figure. But today, something caught his eye that made his smile falter slightly. Behind the boy, partially hidden by the maple tree, was a sign he hadn't noticed before. "For rent, contact immediately." The bus slowed as it approached Ethan's corner, and Joe raised his hand in their customary greeting. Today, the boy was jumping up and down, waving both arms with such enthusiasm that his backpack slipped off one shoulder. Joe couldn't help but chuckle, momentarily forgetting his concern about the sign. What Joe couldn't see was the tear that slipped down Sarah's cheek as she watched from the window, clutching an eviction notice in her trembling hands. The diner where she'd worked for the past 6 years had closed suddenly last week, leaving her without a job and with no way to make next month's rent. She hadn't told Ethan yet that they would have to move in with her sister in another town, hours away from their little corner with the maple tree. As the bus pulled away, Ethan turned toward home, his face glowing with happiness. "Mom!" he called out as he bounded up the worn steps. "Mr. Joe waved with both hands today." "Both hands." Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile. "That's wonderful, sweetie. Ready for breakfast? I made your favorite, cinnamon toast with the last of the sugar." Little did either of them know that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't imagine, all because of a bus driver who saw more than just a little boy waving on a corner. Joe had recognized something in Ethan's wave today, a desperate hope for connection that reminded him of his own childhood, growing up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. As Route 42 continued its journey downtown, Joe's mind was already forming a plan. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest gestures, like a simple wave, could open the door to something extraordinary. He just needed to figure out how to turn this daily ritual into something more. Before that, for rent, sign meant goodbye. The following week brought changes that even Ethan couldn't miss. The morning after he'd shown his mother the drawing, he noticed her having hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Their refrigerator, usually stocked with at least the basics, grew emptier. But what worried him most was that his mother had stopped watching him from the window during his morning ritual. One particularly cold morning, as Ethan stood beneath the maple tree, he pulled his drawing from his backpack. The paper had become soft at the edges from being handled so often, the crayon colors slightly faded. A gust of wind nearly tore it from his fingers, and as he clutched it tighter, he heard the unmistakable sound of paper ripping. His heart sank as a small tear appeared across the yellow bus he'd drawn so carefully. "Ethan!" Sarah's voice called from the house, unusually sharp. "Come back inside right now! You can't go to school today." Confused and disappointed, Ethan looked down the street where Route 42 would appear any minute. He never missed a morning wave, not even when he had the flu last winter and his mother had wrapped him in 2 blankets just to stand outside for those few precious moments. "But Mom, Mr. Joe will be worried if..." "Ethan, please." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "We have to go look at a new place to live. Your Aunt Linda is expecting us." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. New place? Aunt Linda lived hours away, in a different city entirely. His small fingers crumpled the drawing as panic set in. Meanwhile, on Route 42, Joe was growing increasingly concerned. The "For Rent" sign had acquired a bold red "Leased" stamp across it, and he noticed more boxes appearing through the windows of Ethan's house. But what truly alarmed him was the gradual change in the boy's waves. The enthusiastic jumping had been replaced by smaller, more subdued gestures. The bright smile that had always accompanied the wave was dimming, like a light bulb slowly burning out. Joe had seen this pattern before in his decades of driving, families struggling, lives changing, regular faces disappearing from his route without warning or goodbye. That morning, when Joe turned the corner and found the maple tree standing alone, something inside him shifted. For the first time in 20 years, he pulled the bus over at an unauthorized stop. "Take 5, everyone," he announced to his passengers, most of whom were regulars who had watched the daily interaction between driver and boy for years. "I need to check something." Martha Wilson, an elderly teacher who always sat in the front seat, gave him a knowing look. "Go on, Joe. We've all been worried about that little family too." Joe stepped down from the bus, his uniform jacket buttoned against the cold. As he approached the house, he noticed a middle-aged woman next door, watering plants despite the chilly weather. "Excuse me," Joe called out, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him a favorite among his passengers. "I'm the Route 42 driver. The boy who lives here." "Oh, Ethan," the woman interrupted, her face softening. "Such a sweet child. It's a terrible situation, really. Sarah, that's his mother, lost her job when the diner shut down. Nobody saw it coming. Owner had a heart attack, and his children decided to sell rather than keep it running." She leaned closer, lowering her voice though there was no one else around. "I heard them talking last night. They're moving in with Sarah's sister until she can find work. The rental market around here..." She shook her head. "It's impossible for a single mother nowadays. Joe's mind raced back to his own childhood, to the nights his mother had cried over bills when she thought he was asleep. He remembered the shame of wearing the same clothes until they fell apart, of never being able to join school field trips because every penny had to go toward keeping their tiny apartment. But he also remembered Mr. Chin, the grocery store owner who had sometimes slipped extra food into their bags, and Mrs. Rodriguez from the laundromat who had let his mother pay late during particularly tough months. It had been the kindness of their community that had helped them survive. "When are they leaving?" Joe asked, his voice rough with emotion. "End of the week, I think. Sarah's been trying to sell some furniture, but..." The neighbor gestured to the house. "Nobody's buying much these days." As Joe walked back to the bus, his mind was already working on a plan. He thought about his regular passengers, the lawyers and office workers who took his route downtown, the teachers and nurses who rode back in the afternoons. Many of them had commented over the years about how Ethan's morning waves brightened their days. Inside the house, unaware of Joe's visit, Ethan sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes. His mother had told him he could only take what would fit in one box in his backpack, and Linda's house wasn't very big, and they'd be sharing a room until things got better. He looked at the drawing in his hands, now crumpled and torn. With careful movements, he smoothed it out and placed it in his special box, along with his favorite books and the photo of him and his mom at the park last summer. Then, fighting back tears, he went to his window and removed the carefully crafted paper bus he taped there months ago, the one that let him pretend he was riding Route 42 every afternoon when he came home from school. Sarah watched her son from his doorway, her heart breaking. She tried everything to avoid this moment, had applied for countless jobs, had even considered sleeping on their neighbor's couch and sending Ethan to Linda's alone. But the eviction notice had made the decision for her. They had 3 days left in the only home her son had ever known. What Sarah didn't know was that on Route 42, Joe was already putting his plan into action. As he drove toward downtown, he shared Ethan's story with his passengers, watching in the mirror as faces shifted from concern to determination. Sometimes, he thought, it takes a village, or in this case, a busload of strangers, to change a family's fate. That evening, Joe sat at his kitchen table, his untouched coffee growing cold. His wife Maria watched him with knowing eyes as he spread out his retirement paperwork, documents they'd been excitedly reviewing just weeks ago, planning for their golden years after his 43 years of service. "You're thinking about that little boy again, aren't you?" Maria asked softly, placing her hand over his weathered one. The kitchen light caught the simple gold band on her finger, the same ring Joe had given her 35 years ago, when they were just two young dreamers with nothing but hope and determination. "I can't retire yet, Maria," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not when I know I could help. Remember when we first got married? When the transmission went out in our car, and we thought we'd lose everything?" Maria's eyes softened at the memory. "Mr. Williams from the auto shop. He let us pay in installments, no interest. Said his father had done the same for someone else 30 years before." "Exactly." Joe nodded, pushing aside the retirement papers. "We've been blessed, Maria. Our kids are grown, the house is paid off, and we have some savings. Maybe it's our turn to be someone's Mr. Williams." But as Joe shared his emerging plan, his enthusiasm was met with an unexpected response. Maria stood up, walked to their bedroom, and returned with an old shoebox. Inside was a collection of carefully preserved newspaper clippings, photographs, and letters. "Before you start anything," she said, spreading the contents on the table, "you need to see these." Joe's eyes widened as he recognized faces from his past routes, passengers whose lives had intersected with his over the decades. There was a graduation photo of Tommy Chin, who had ridden Joe's bus to community college for 2 years, working multiple jobs to support his family. A wedding announcement for Sarah Rodriguez, whose mother had been a regular passenger during her battle with cancer. Letters from families thanking Joe for small kindnesses he'd almost forgotten, waiting an extra minute for a running passenger, helping with heavy groceries, offering an encouraging word on difficult days. "You've already been someone's Mr. Williams many times over," Maria said gently. But this time, you don't have to do it alone. The next morning, Joe arrived at the bus depot earlier than usual. He carefully placed a repurposed cookie tin near his seat, decorated with a simple sign. Hope for Ethan. Then he began his route, his heart pounding with anticipation. As regular passengers boarded, Joe shared the story, not just of the little boy who waved, but of a community that had the power to change lives. Martha Wilson, the elderly teacher, was the first to respond. "We've all seen that child's smile brighten our mornings," she declared, dropping a $50 bill into the tin. "My late husband always said that joy shared is joy multiplied." Throughout the day, Joe watched in amazement as the tin filled with not just money, but notes of encouragement and small gifts. A teenage girl contributed her babysitting money. A businessman in an expensive suit emptied his wallet and returned in the afternoon with more. A group of college students organized an impromptu collection among themselves. But it was Mrs. Chin, who ran the small grocery store downtown, who surprised Joe the most. After hearing the story, she didn't just contribute money, she offered Sarah a job. "My son Tommy," she explained, referring to the same Tommy from Joe's memories, "just opened a second store across town. We need a manager we can trust. Someone who understands hard work and responsibility. From what you've told me about this, Sarah." The twist came when Joe learned that Mrs. Chen's new store was just 3 blocks from where Sarah and Ethan were planning to move. It wasn't just money they were raising now, it was hope, opportunity, and a future. However, complications arose as Joe's plan expanded. His supervisor noticed the donation tin and called him into the office, citing regulations against soliciting funds from passengers. Joe faced a choice: remove the tin or risk disciplinary action just months before his retirement. Standing in his supervisor's office, Joe straightened his shoulders. "Sir, in 43 years, I've never been late, never had an accident, and never asked for special treatment. But today I'm asking. Let me finish this one thing. Let me show that little boy that his waves meant something to all of us." The supervisor, Mr. Peterson, was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "My daughter waved at buses until she was 10, he said quietly, adding his contribution to the tin. "Just keep it discreet, Joe. And make it count." That evening, as Joe counted the day's collections at his kitchen table, Maria worked beside him, organizing the notes and gifts into a presentable package. The total was growing, but time was running out. They had only 1 day left before Ethan and his mother were scheduled to leave. "It's not enough," Joe muttered, running his fingers through his gray hair. "We're still short of what they need for a security deposit on a decent apartment." Maria watched her husband's frustration build, then disappeared into their bedroom again. This time, she returned with a small velvet box. "My mother's pearls," she said, placing the box in Joe's hands. "She always said jewelry was meant to bring joy. I can't think of a better use for them." Joe stared at his wife, this woman who had supported every crazy dream and noble cause he pursued over their years together. "Maria, these are your inheritance. And I'm inheriting them to someone who needs them more," she said firmly. "Besides, I have something better than pearls, I have you." As they embraced, Joe's mind wandered to tomorrow's route. He had one chance to turn these contributions into a miracle, one opportunity to show Ethan that sometimes a simple wave could ripple out and return as a tidal wave of kindness. What he didn't know was that the biggest surprise was yet to come, and it wouldn't be from the pearls, the donations, or even Mrs. Chen's job offer. It would come from the most unexpected source of all, proving that the true measure of community isn't just in grand gestures, but in the small decisions that connect us all. The morning of Ethan's planned departure dawned gray and misty, the kind of day that made the world feel smaller and more intimate. Sarah stood in their nearly empty living room, surrounded by packed boxes and the echoes of memories. They would be leaving for Aunt Linda's in just a few hours, as soon as the small moving truck arrived. Ethan hadn't left his room yet. Through his closed door, Sarah could hear him talking softly, practicing his goodbye speech to an imaginary Mr. Joe. Her son's words drifted through the thin walls. Thank you for being my friend, even though we never really met." The sound of brakes squealing outside interrupted the moment. Sarah rushed to the window, expecting to see the moving truck. Instead, she froze at the sight of Route 42's familiar shape emerging from the morning mist, pulling up directly in front of their house. But this wasn't the usual bus. This was something entirely different. Streamers and bright colors fluttered from the windows. A hand-painted banner hung along its side reading, "Ethan's Special Ride." And there, stepping down from the driver's seat with a broad smile, was the man Sarah had only known through her son's descriptions. "Mom!" Ethan's door flew open as he raced to the window. "Mom, it's Mr. Joe! And he's stopping!" Before Sarah could respond, a knock at their door made them both jump. Opening it, they found themselves face to face with Joe Martinez, his uniform crisp and neat, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but Route 42 has a very special passenger request today." Ethan peeked around his mother's legs, eyes wide with wonder. "Me? You've been waiting at this bus for 4 years, young man," Joe said, kneeling down to Ethan's level. "I think it's about time you got to ride it." Sarah started to protest. They had to pack. The moving truck was coming, they couldn't afford. But Joe held up a gentle hand. "Please, Mrs. Matthews. There's something you both need to see." As they stepped onto the bus, Ethan gasped. The interior had been transformed. Balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and every seat was filled with familiar faces, the passengers who had watched this little boy grow up through their windows. Martha Wilson stood up, her silver hair catching the morning light. "Welcome aboard, Ethan! We've been waiting to meet you properly." But the real surprise came when Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the back of the bus. "Mrs. Matthews," she said, addressing Sarah directly, "I understand you're looking for work." What followed was a whirlwind of revelations. The passengers had done more than just raise money, they had created a network of support. Mrs. Chen's job offer came with an advance on her first month's salary. A real estate agent who rode the afternoon route had found them an affordable apartment near the new grocery store. The local school district, represented by Martha Wilson, had already arranged to transfer Ethan's records. "But how?" Sarah managed, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you all do this?" "Because your son taught us something precious," Martha explained, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Every morning, rain or shine, this child reminded us that joy is a choice. That kindness costs nothing but means everything." Joe reached beneath his seat and pulled out an envelope, thick with the community's contributions. But before he could hand it to Sarah, a commotion at the back of the bus drew everyone's attention. An elderly man in a well-worn suit stood up slowly. "I've been riding this route for 20 years, he announced in a wavering voice. "Never said much to anyone. But I've watched this boy wave every morning, and it reminded me of my own son." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "We lost him 10 years ago. But seeing Ethan, it brought back the joy of those simple moments." The man made his way forward, leaning heavily on his cane. From his pocket, he withdrew a folded document. "I own a small building downtown," he explained. "Nothing fancy, but there's a vacant apartment on the second floor. Mrs. Matthews, if you'll accept, I'd like to offer you a year's lease. No security deposit required." Sarah swayed slightly, overwhelmed. Joe quickly guided her to a seat, while Ethan looked around in amazement at all the faces he'd only ever seen through glass. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. From his driver's seat, Joe pulled out one more item, a familiar piece of crumpled paper, carefully smoothed and professionally framed. It was Ethan's drawing of the bus with the 2 stick figures. "Your neighbor found this in your recycling bin," Joe explained. "She thought I should have it. But I think it belongs on the wall of your new home, as a reminder that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the connections we make, even if they start with just a wave." Ethan touched the frame with trembling fingers, then looked up at Joe with tears in his eyes. "But how will I wave to you from the new apartment?" Joe smiled mysteriously. Well, that's the thing about Route 42, he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a bus schedule. It makes a turn right past your new building. 7:15 every morning, just like always. The bus erupted in cheers and applause. As Sarah hugged her son, still trying to process this miracle, Joe returned to his driver's seat and pressed a button. The familiar hiss of the bus doors closing brought a fresh wave of tears to Ethan's eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. Ready for your first official ride on Route 42? Joe called out, his voice carrying over the happy chatter of the passengers. Ethan nodded enthusiastically, then paused. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out the paper bus he'd taken from his window. With ceremonial solemnity, he walked to the front of the bus and held it out to Joe. I made this so I could pretend I was riding with you, he explained. But I don't need it anymore, because now I get to ride for real. As Route 42 wound its way through the city streets, Ethan experienced his neighborhood from an entirely new perspective. From his special seat right behind Joe, the familiar buildings and streets he'd walked past countless times transformed into something magical. But it wasn't just the view that was different, it was the people who shared this journey with him. Martha Wilson had moved to sit beside him, pulling out a small package wrapped in newspaper. I've been carrying this for 3 days, she confessed, her eyes twinkling. Waiting for the right moment. Ethan carefully unwrapped the package, gasping as he revealed a leather-bound book. The Little Engine That Could. But this wasn't just any copy, it was worn and well-loved, its pages softened by time and countless readings. This book belonged to my son, Martha explained, her voice soft with memory. He used to say that the little engine reminded him of you, always believing, always trying, never giving up. He's grown now, teaching children in Japan. When I told him about you, he insisted you should have this. Sarah watched from her seat across the aisle, her hands clutching the envelope of donations and the lease agreement that would change their lives. She noticed how the other passengers weren't just observers to this moment. They were participants in a story that had been unfolding for 4 years without any of them realizing it. Mrs. Chen moved to sit next to Sarah, speaking quietly about the job that awaited her. My son Tommy, she said, pulling out her phone to show pictures. He started just like you, a single parent, struggling to make ends meet. Now he owns 2 stores. But you know what he says was the key to his success? Sarah shook her head, still overwhelmed by the morning's events. Community, Mrs. Chen said firmly. The people who believe in you before you can believe in yourself. That's why I know you'll be perfect for this position. You've raised a son who understands the value of connecting with others, even in the smallest ways. The bus turned onto a street Sarah didn't recognize, and Joe's voice called out from the front. Ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a small detour to show our special guests their new home. As the bus slowed in front of a well-maintained brick building, the elderly man who had offered them the apartment, Mr. Harrison, as he'd introduced himself, pointed to a second-floor window with a small balcony. That's your view, he said proudly. And look there, at the corner. Ethan pressed his face against the window, his eyes widening as he spotted another maple tree, its branches reaching toward the balcony. Mom! It's just like our old spot. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished with his surprises. From his weathered briefcase, he pulled out another document. Mrs. Matthews, there's something else you should know about the apartment. 25 years ago, a young woman lived there with her little boy. She worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, but she never lost her kindness. That woman was my wife. His voice cracked slightly as he continued. She passed away last year, and her last wish was that this apartment would go to another family who needed a fresh start. When I heard your story, he paused, collecting himself. Sometimes the world has a way of coming full circle. The bus erupted in a fresh round of applause, but Joan noticed something that others didn't. Ethan had gone quiet, staring at his paper bus in his hands. Catching Martha's eye in the rearview mirror, Joe made a subtle gesture. She understood immediately. Ethan, Martha said gently, would you like to hear a story about another little boy who used to ride this bus? Ethan nodded, still clutching his paper creation. Many years ago, Martha began, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. There was a boy who rode Route 42 every morning. He sat right where you're sitting now, and he had a dream. He wanted to grow up to help people, to make a difference in their lives. That boy, she paused for effect, was Mr. Joe. Joe's shoulders straightened slightly at the mention of his name, but he kept his eyes on the road as Martha continued. Every day, he would watch the city wake up through these windows, and he would think about how many stories were happening behind all those doors and windows. He promised himself that one day, he would be part of those stories. Ethan looked at Joe with newfound wonder. Is that why you always waved back? Joe caught the boy's eye in the mirror. Partly, he admitted. But mostly, I waved back because you reminded me of that promise I made to myself. And now, looking at all the people here today, I can see that you helped me keep it. The moment was interrupted by a small commotion near the back of the bus. A young woman in scrubs, who had been quietly observing until now, stood up. I'm sorry, she said, her voice carrying over the murmur of conversation. But I have something to add to this story. 4 years ago, I was a nursing student, taking this bus to my morning clinicals. I was ready to quit. The stress, the long hours, it all seemed too much. But every morning, this little boy's wave, it gave me strength. Today, I'm head nurse at City General's pediatric unit. She made her way forward, pulling something from her pocket, a small pin in the shape of a waving hand. We give these to our young patients now, to remind them that small gestures of hope matter. We call them Ethan's waves. Sarah couldn't hold back her tears any longer. Her son hadn't just been waving at a bus, he'd been sending ripples of hope through the entire city, touching lives they'd never even known about. She watched as Ethan absorbed this revelation, his small face serious with the weight of understanding. Standing up, Ethan walked to the front of the bus. With careful movements, he placed his paper bus on Joe's dashboard. Can this stay here? He asked quietly. So other kids can see it, and know that sometimes the best journeys start with just a wave? Joe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As the bus continued its route, now filled with conversation and laughter, he glanced at the paper bus catching the morning light. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest things we do can cast the longest shadows, and sometimes those shadows turn out to be made of light. Years had painted the city with changes, like an artist adding layers to a beloved canvas. The maple tree outside Ethan and Sarah's apartment had grown taller, its branches now perfectly framing their balcony. The corner grocery store under Mrs. Chen's guidance had flourished, with Sarah's management helping it become a neighborhood cornerstone. Joe Martinez sat on his front porch, enjoying his first autumn of retirement. The morning air carried a familiar crispness, reminding him of countless dawn routes and one special passenger who had changed everything. In his hands he held a letter that had arrived that morning, the return address bearing a familiar street name. Dear Mr. Joe, You probably won't be surprised to learn that I still wave at Route 42 every morning. Different driver now, of course, but the tradition continues. Mom says I'm too old for such things, being 17 and all, but some habits are worth keeping. Remember that paper bus you kept on your dashboard all these years? I heard it inspired quite a few stories. But I don't think I ever told you my favorite one. It's about the day after our special ride, when we moved into our new apartment. That morning, I was standing on our balcony, worried that everything would feel different. But then I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a little girl on the corner, maybe 5 years old, waving at the bus with all her might. She had a small pin on her jacket, one of those Ethan's waves from the hospital. I watched her every morning after that, thinking about how circles complete themselves. And now, I wanted you to be the first to know, I've been accepted into the City Transit Authority's management training program. They have this new initiative called Community Routes, inspired by what you started on Route 42. The idea is to train drivers to be community connectors, to see their routes as more than just stops and schedules. But here's the real surprise, Mr. Joe. Remember that elderly passenger, Mr. Harrison, who gave us the apartment? He passed away last month. In his will, he left something unexpected, a trust fund dedicated to helping single-parent families afford transportation to work and school. They're calling it the Route 42 Fellowship. Mom's doing amazing, by the way. She's regional manager for all 3 Chen family stores now. Mrs. Chen says she's never seen anyone with such a natural gift for bringing people together. I think she learned that from you. There's something else you should know. Every Friday, I volunteer at City General's pediatric unit. I help distribute those Ethan's waves, pins, but more importantly, I tell them the story, our story, about how a simple wave can start a chain reaction of kindness that changes lives. Last week, a small boy asked me if I still had the bus driver's cap you gave me that day. When I showed it to him, his eyes lit up just like mine must have years ago. He asked if he could try it on, and in that moment, I saw myself in him. That same longing for connection, that same belief in the magic of simple gestures. Which brings me to the real reason I'm writing. Next month, the City Transit Authority is dedicating a new bus stop, right where I used to stand under our old maple tree. They're calling it Martinez Point. And they're installing a special bench with a plaque that reads, "Every journey begins with a wave." They want me to speak at the dedication ceremony. I'll be wearing your cap, if that's okay. And I thought, maybe you could be there too. Not just as a guest, but to help me cut the ribbon. After all, you're the one who taught me that sometimes the most important stops are the ones that aren't on the schedule. There's one more thing. That paper bus you kept all these years? The one that inspired so many others to make their own? I found out recently that the hospital's art therapy program has the kids make them now. They call it Project Route 42. And every bus they make carries a message of hope. But the most amazing part? Some of those paper buses have made their way across the country. There's a website now where people share photos of them, each with its own story of kindness and connection. Your dashboard decoration has become a symbol of hope for thousands. So thank you, Mr. Joe. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the best journeys aren't about where we're going, but about the waves we share along the way. With gratitude and love. Ethan. P.S. Mom wants you and Mrs. Martinez to come for Sunday dinner. She's finally perfected that recipe Mrs. Martinez shared for arroz con pollo. Though between you and me, I think Mrs. Chen still sneaks in to add her own special touch when Mom isn't looking. Joe folded the letter carefully, his weathered hands trembling slightly. From inside the house, he could hear Maria humming as she prepared breakfast, the same way she had every morning during his 4 decades of dawn routes. Standing up, he walked to the small table beside his porch chair and picked up an object that had become as familiar as his own reflection, his old bus driver's cap. He'd been saving it for a special occasion, and now he knew exactly when that would be. Taking one last look at the quiet morning street, Joe smiled as he saw a city bus pass by. Right on schedule, a small child on the corner waved enthusiastically, a familiar pin glinting on their jacket. The driver, following a tradition they might not even understand the origins of, waved back. In that moment, Joe understood something profound about the ripples we create in the world. Sometimes they travel far beyond our sight, touching shores we never knew existed. And sometimes, like the morning sun catching a paper bus on a dashboard, they reflect back to remind us that the simplest gestures can cast the longest light. He reached for his phone to call Ethan, then stopped. Some messages, he decided, are better delivered in person. After all, he had a dedication ceremony to prepare for, and a story that was far from over. Because sometimes, the most beautiful part of a wave isn't the gesture itself, it's the endless ripples of kindness it creates, flowing outward into a world that desperately needs reminding that hope often arrives in the simplest packages: a morning bus, a faithful wave, and the courage to believe that small actions can change the world, one route at a time.